It's great having everyone here. So, were people able to read this section of the book? And those that you read, was there anything that stood out to you? Did you like this section? Did you not like it? I think this section of the book, in my own personal estimation, is one of the weaker sections of it. But I don't know, did anything stand out?
Weaker in what way?
It just like the cohesive idea wasn't quite as strong as in other sections. It ends very strong, like it ends strong. But I don't know, did anyone remember anything that they thought was interesting about this section?
Well,
yeah.
My general thinking of it was, by the time I got most into it, how confusing religion is.
Oh, how confusing religion is?
Extrapolate your own ideas from
okay.
the people.
Yeah.
No wonder it's a mess.
No wonder it's a mess. I mean, yeah. I mean, you look at, you have all these different, church histories and all that stuff, like, and they're just, people believe different things, and they get really tight about what they believe, right? And by the way, Ann, you need to believe exactly like I do. That's
Being recorded.
But yeah, that's a good observation. Was there anything else?
Particularly like the one about with science.
Okay, yeah. Well, that makes sense.
Because I'm in a scientific field or what. Yeah. But the one thing that I highlighted is that people say science and religion are in opposition, but it's like your thumb and your forefinger are in opposition. They both work together. You know, I liked that.
Yeah.
Really,
if they're taken in the right context.
Yeah.
Both can be in left field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They can support each other.
Yeah.
You know, if you let if I really believe like the evolution, people that are like macroevolution, that's a belief just as much as religion, because there's no proof.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So like that's with the big stuff. Yeah. So like that's definitely part. Was there any other parts of the book that dealt with? All right, so let's get into like one of the questions today, and I think it's an interesting question, and we'll probably talk too much about it, so I'll have to cut some of you off. It's so if you were to ask like a non-Christian around you what the Christian message is, would they convey something to you that is good news or bad news? What do you think? What do you think? Both. Where have you heard someone say good news? And where have you heard some people say bad news? Yeah, you can go ahead.
You go out in church. You have this doctrine, if you die today, do you know where you're going to go?
Yeah.
That just tells me that person asking the question doesn't know.
Yeah. So like this, it's your first time here.
Right.
And like you saying very succinctly ideas that we started this whole thing on, like that's something I say a lot on Sunday morning too, that there's these messages that when you look at it, it's like, I don't know, that doesn't feel like good news.
Exactly.
Yeah, that doesn't feel like good news.
Is the law good news?
Like that's I don't
Law's condemning.
Yeah, it is.
About grace good news? Very much.
It's Lee, you look like you wanted to say something. Did you want to say something?
I said that unfortunately, grace should be good news, and we tend to try to push things. Like that's going to make everything better if we push things. Where sometimes just being yourself and small little things of grace mean a lot.
Yeah, like kind of trusting the Spirit it'll work through you and put you in the right places and all of that. Yeah.
And sometimes you'll find grace in the most ridiculous places. I have a story I tell where we were in the car. We had a severe car accident, and my mother went through the windshield. And she was bleeding profusely. It was outside of a car dealership. They called the ambulance. We're waiting like 20 minutes. My mother's bleeding to death. And out of the car dealership comes a guy in a brand new red convertible with white interior and no plastic covers.
Yeah.
And this guy literally threw my mother in the car and drove us to the hospital.
Mhm. Yeah.
And until today, every so often something will happen and I'll remember him and I'll say a little prayer because I couldn't have done what that man did.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty big.
That was great. I mean, that was grace. I mean, if Gene would have
Yeah.
said, I'm going to put the lady in the car, I would have said over my dead body.
Yeah. Like yeah. I mean, because that's a pretty big, like you said, like brand new thing. It's very expensive. And realizing that human life around him is much, much more like that's.
Yeah, I mean, my mother was arguing with him. I'm going to ruin your car. And he's going to be dead.
Yeah. So it's,
But I think too, it depends on if it's a really unchurched person that has no experience at church.
Yeah.
They get their information about Christians from the news.
Yeah.
The movie.
Yeah.
So that their opinion is bad.
Realistic.
But if you have a personal relationship, they might say most Christians are Democrats or whatever, but that friend of mine,
Yeah.
they're not. They're kind of, it's that personal relationship.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Let's
I
see.
think if we show humility in what we do to anyone
Mhm.
in any way, it will bring more people to find out more about you and what you believe in
Mhm.
than pushing anything.
Yeah. And I think that's like you said, that really, that works kind of all the way through it. So that's good. So let's start off with the video. Remember, the video is 20 minutes that we'll watch of Philip Yancey here, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So.
We sometimes look at prisoners and think we've got to tell them how bad they really are. Have them come to grips with just how awful what they did was, that they're sinners, that they have to come clean in order to be accepted by God. Prisoners already know that they've done something wrong. They might not admit it openly, but the best thing we can offer them is the good news of God's forgiveness, the good news of God's friendship.
You may remember that back in our first session together, I talked about an article I wrote for the Huffington Post on the topic, What Good is God? I mentioned 3 levels in which God can transform: individuals, communities, entire societies. And then I read you some of the angry responses I got from skeptics. So today I want to face into the question, is the Christian faith really good news? Evidently, a lot of people don't think so. They see our faith as bad news, not good news. If you talk with an aggressive non-Christian, there's a good chance you'll hear about some of the terrible things done by the church. Slavery, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the burning of witches. And they're right, the church has done some terrible things. At some universities, that's all you'll hear about the church. So if we want to communicate with people from that background, we have to be ready to answer the question, is it really good news? So let's revisit those 3 levels that I mentioned. First, there's the individual level. As a journalist, I've heard from and have written about many people whose lives have been transformed by the gospel. And I'm sure that some of you sitting in your group can tell similar stories, and I hope you do. You may remember the prostitute that I described from Bulgaria. She said, "Sometime when you're at the low, you cry for help." I have met people at the low. Prostitutes, drug users, prisoners on death row, people with leprosy. There are also stories all the way through the Bible of people at the low. Adam and Eve, who made a terrible choice and spoiled paradise. King David, who committed adultery and murder. Peter, who 3 times cursed Jesus. "I never knew the blankety blank." Saul of Tarsus, who helped kill the first Christian martyr. Yet each one of those people got another chance. Although they made awful mistakes, God forgave and greatly used them. I keep returning to the scene of a woman caught in the very act of adultery who was dragged before Jesus by religious leaders. The Pharisees looked on that scene and saw 2 kinds of people. Good people like us, bad people like that woman there, caught red-handed in a crime. Jesus looked on that same scene and saw it differently. He too saw 2 kinds of people. Those in need of grace who admit it, like the woman, trembling, terrified, probably stripped to the waist as a mark of shame, sure that any minute now the stones would start raining down. And people in need of grace who denied it, like the accusing Pharisees. Grace is a free gift of God. There's nothing we can do to deserve it, to earn it. It's free. But to receive a gift, you have to have open hands. Otherwise, it falls to the ground, unreceived. All too often, the religious people, like Pharisees, had their hands closed in a tight fist. "I don't need your help, thank you." And grace falls to the ground. You sometimes hear Christians called self-righteous. Actually, we're the opposite. We know well that we're not self-righteous. We've come to God admitting our need. Any goodness in us comes from God as a free gift of grace. Is the gospel good news? It is for someone at the low who knows their need and who cries for help. I want you to meet a man who's been a friend of mine for more than 30 years. You probably know that after serving time for Watergate-related activities, Chuck Colson founded a group called Prison Fellowship. You may not know that similar programs were founded in more than 100 countries around the world. My friend Ron Nickel directed this global work. Ron knows about transformation of individual prisoners and of Christians who care for the most neglected people on the planet. Sometimes after a change of government, these prisoners are released and they go on to lead their countries, such as Nelson Mandela did in South Africa.
Every prison is difficult. I've been in a couple of prisons here in the United States. I was in one not too long ago in New York. Maximum security. Every movement is observed. Every movement is controlled. And it can't help but destroy the souls of the people inside. I was in one of our North American prisons at a chapel service. There was a young Native American fellow who was strumming away at a guitar. After the service, I went to him and I learned his name was Eddie. And I said, "Eddie, tell me your story." And he told me the tragic story of having been in and out of prison 20 times. And I thought, how tragic. What would happen to Eddie if somebody went into that prison and embraced Eddie as a brother and said, "Eddie, when you come out, I'm going to be there for you"? Friendship involves conversation, and one of the things that I do when I go into prison, I never ask somebody why they are in prison. I ask them to tell me their story. Because the part of the good news is that the end of the story doesn't have to be prison. The end of the story doesn't have to be failure and embarrassment. we've had some marvelous experiences in Rwanda following the genocide. That horrific thing that happened there some 20 years ago, where people were massacred and over 100,000 people were imprisoned in Rwanda. And so at the invitation of the government, we went in and began working with inmates in the prison. And so when they were ready, we invited victims from the community to come into prison. Those victims had also been prepared. They listened to each other's stories. There was a sense of completion that came. And when those inmates were released, there was great reconciliation that took place. They went back to the community and started building houses for surviving victims, family members of people they may have killed, people who lost everything. We now have 3 reconciliation villages in Rwanda, built by inmates, people who participated in the genocide and want to pay back. They can never give back a life, but they can make life better for the surviving victims. And that's changing the fabric of the community.
As I've traveled with Ron, I've met Christians who visit prisoners, bring them food, care for their children, help them find jobs when they're released. Individuals get transformed, yes, but it's usually because of people like that who care, because they feel loved. Let's move up a level from individuals to community. The first book I wrote was titled, Where is God When It Hurts? And as a result, I've been invited to many places of great suffering. Virginia Tech, after the shootings there. Columbine High School, the Aurora Theater shootings, Newtown, Connecticut, Mumbai, India, the night of the bombings of the Taj Mahal Hotel. In addition, for some years, my wife worked as a hospice chaplain. Every day she went to work, she counseled patients and their families who were facing death. Here's one important lesson we both learned. If you go through hard times or tragedy, you'd better have a community of support around you. For example, if you have major surgery, a community can help fight what I call the enemies of recovery. Any doctor will tell you that things like fear, stress, anger, anxiety can help determine how well and how fast you recover. And hundreds of surveys show that if you're connected with a caring community, like a church, who will bring you meals, take care of your children, or even your pets, and help relieve that stress and anxiety, you'll recover faster and better. If you survive a major disaster, as happened to New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, you'd better hope there's a community of support around you. At such a time, the church is at its best. Long after the federal government packed up and left, churches from Houston and Dallas and Baton Rouge were still sending crews every weekend to repair houses and shelter and feed the people of New Orleans. Is Christianity good news? It is when you need a community of support. As I've gone to places of suffering, I've seen the tangible difference that our message of comfort and hope can make. I remember back in December 2012 when I got the call to go to Newtown, Connecticut, scene of the horrific shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Frankly, I was terrified. What could I say to parents who had kissed their 6-year-old and 7-year-old children goodbye one morning, put them on a school bus, and then learned later that day they'd been murdered? As it happened, I was reading some of the writings of the New Atheist for an article I was writing. According to those authors, we live in a blind, pitiless universe. We're the products of random chance, an accident of nature never to be repeated. It struck me that in a time of tragedy, we Christians do have a message of good news. I've noted that when something bad happens, like September 11 or the Boston Marathon bombings or the shootings at Sandy Hook, atheists tend to keep quiet. The New York Times turns over their op-ed pages to priests, pastors, rabbis. I realize there's one question harder than where is God when it hurts, and that is, where is no God when it hurts. And so I could stand before the grieving community in Newtown and offer true comfort. If we are grieved and upset by the violence and evil on this planet, God is even more grieved and upset. We know how God feels because God has given us a face. It's the face of Jesus, and it's a face that is streaked with tears. To know how God feels about events like that, just follow Jesus around and see how he responds to a widow who's lost her only son, or even to a Roman soldier whose servant fell ill. We know how God feels about the loss of those children at Sandy Hook Elementary School. God is on the side of the one who suffers, the one who grieves. And even more important, God has promised to do something about it, to restore our planet to a world with no pain, no tears, no death. I am going away to prepare a place for you, Jesus told his disciples. And I could say to those grieving parents in Newtown, your sons and daughters are now in a safe place, the loving arms of God. Their lives did not end forever on December 14th, 2012. That's good news indeed. We have one more level to talk about. The gospel changes individuals, then communities, and finally, it has a transforming effect on entire societies. To introduce this section, if you truly want an answer to the question, is the Christian faith really good news? I suggest you travel internationally. Compare the justice systems, the prison systems, freedom of the press, democracy, or even easier, spend some time on the internet. Check out Transparency International, which rates nations on their level of corruption, or the Freedom Index, which rates how free countries are, or the Prosperity Index, or the measures of equality between men and women. Here's what you'll find. Of the top 20 countries on each one of those lists, all but one or maybe two will be countries with a strong Christian heritage. They may not be church-going countries now, but they are living out the fruits of the gospel's impact. Jesus used images of small things to describe the kingdom, a pinch of salt that preserves a whole slab of meat, just a sprinkling of yeast that causes the entire loaf to rise. The smallest seed in the garden, but it grows into a great tree in which the birds of the air come to nest. Even in countries considered post-Christian, such as in Europe, the effects of the gospel linger on. I saw something of how this works firsthand on a visit to India. The early British missionaries there encountered the caste system, and they thought, well, let's start at the top with the Brahmins and we'll work with them. We'll build schools and hospitals, and gradually the good effects will percolate down to the lower castes. They didn't really understand the caste system. Upper castes don't have much to do with lower castes. More recently, mission organizations have started working with lower castes, especially the Dalits, who used to be called untouchables. Not long ago, the organization Operation Mobilization, or OM, decided to open a series of schools called Good Shepherd Schools, just for Dalits. You'll never educate them, skeptics said. They're barely human. They can't learn. They were wrong. Now over 100 of these Good Shepherd schools exist, and they're thriving. I visited one of them. Some 400 kids were lined up in formation waiting for us. They sang songs, they greeted us, and invited us into their classrooms. Now, I've been in school classrooms in the United States where some kids almost dare you to teach them. Leave me alone, I'm trying to text message my girlfriend. These kids in India were so grateful and so proud of a chance to learn. For 5,000 years, Dalits, the untouchables, had been deprived of education, and now they were soaking it in. They wanted to show off what they had learned. And they must have thought they got extra credit for volume because they were shouting. First, they went through the ABCs. Capital A, small a, capital B, small b, capital C, small c. Then they went through the addition tables. 1 + 1 is 2. 1 + 2 is 3. And then subtraction and multiplication and then division. Our ears were ringing by the time we left those classrooms. Later that same day, a doctor who worked with OM gave us a tour of what she called a pipe village. A concrete factory makes huge storm drain pipes, and when there's a defect, they just throw it into a field. Well, in India, nothing goes unused. You can see the size of the pipes in this photograph. My wife and I are standing inside one, and if you look through it, you can see that Indian families block them up and use these pipes as their homes. They sit in the sun all day, the broiling Indian sun, and an entire family lives in one of these small pipes, but at least they have a little bit of shelter. As we were touring around, we noticed a teenage girl trailing us. She was dressed in rags, but she looked familiar, and the doctor explained that she had been at school that morning. The girl showed us where she lived, in one of the concrete pipes, and we asked her about her education. "I'm graduating next year," she said proudly. "Oh, then what?" "I'm going to university." "Oh, what will you study?" "I'm going to be a doctor." "Is that so? Do you know what kind?" "I'm going to be a cardiologist." The OM doctor said that she probably will. She's one of the brightest students we have. Just a few years before, that Dalit girl's only prospects were to sweep streets with a straw broom or to clean toilets. Worse, she could have been a beggar or sold by her family into sexual slavery. Now she had dignity and pride and a bright future ahead of her. The smallest seed in the garden becomes a great tree in which the birds of the air come to nest. Wherever the gospel takes root, something like that happens. Yes, the church has made grievous errors over the centuries. Despite it all, the kingdom of God continues to grow, and wherever it grows comes freedom and dignity and compassion and democracy. We will never create a perfect society. God knows our own society needs a lot of help. But in measurable, inarguable ways, wherever it's planted, the gospel brings hope.
What part in the video, what part of the video or anything kind of stood out to you that you thought was interesting?
Well, I think back to when my wife Barbara passed. She passed at 9:15 in the evening. My pastor,
Who's that? Yeah.
was there by 9:45, and we spent time together with Barb. And then the funeral director came, and people brought me food. People prayed for me. People called me on the phone every morning, every evening. "How are you doing? Is everything okay? Can I bring you anything?" All people from this little church. I mean, I just was blown away. So thank you all, including Cheryl.
Well, that's good. It's like those mustard seed things. Yeah. It also helps. It's that he's like 2 streets down from me. like that. That's
Five.
Yeah, five. And so was there anything else that kind of stood out to you? Or we kind of get into the questions. That was interesting.
Well, I kind of thought about, and from your sermon too, the mustard seed that makes that huge tree that provides shade or grace. The person sitting under there and getting relief doesn't have to believe that tree came from a mustard seed.
Yeah.
To feel the grace. You don't have to, you can't come in until you know all the whole story. You know, we don't have to make sure that they're going to be a Christian to show them grace, I guess.
Yeah. and I like kind of how he presents that in this section with his individuals, communities, and societies, that when you have that kingdom of God breaking in idea of the mustard seed and God using those small things, like we're not going through it today, but that God always uses the small things to shame the wise. That's like a Paul thing, isn't it? Yeah. And like and so that idea, coming in, and I really like how he kind of weaved it around with the prison fellowship guy, and then talking about, his own experience with sitting in tragedy, and then the whole society. Like and I thought his point in the book was really interesting, that it's measurable, that when you see the past effects of the mustard seed, like it comes through. Yeah, there's problems, but you can really see that arc of God's kingdom, that there's a foundation there. And I thought that was an interesting thing. Yeah. And I think it's encouraging too.
I would like to have heard a little more about the prison ministry.
Oh yeah.
It's got to be really tough.
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. Prisons stuff. And I think that's why, like, Jesus talks about it multiple times, visiting people in the prison, like that's, you're looking at a community, a society described bottom, almost bottom feeder. It's like, you deserve to be separated from the rest of us because you're a threat, or you did all these things. And like that's huge. Like me as a pastor, I don't really do much in the prisons. And that's whenever I read that, you have the two sides of you, where it's like, I should do more, and it's like, let's just hurry up and get past this. And, like but it's definitely true.
Yeah, as much encouragement and positive reinforcement we need every day, and kindness, they don't get anything, I don't think, unless there's a pastor.
Yeah. And I like what he said too. Like, you could tell how he, I can't remember his name right now in the video, but how he talked about it, he's like, I just want to hear their story. It's like that they weren't just that sentence. It's like, what's going on around you?
Eddie.
Yeah, with Eddie. Yeah. Well, yeah, with the other guy. Yeah.
I guess he's asking what brought them to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're kind of looking at the whole picture of the person rather than just why are you in the pit right now?
I would also think they're the easiest ones to accept the gospel.
Yeah.
They're backed into a corner and they've got nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Whereas we are out here and we can still do this, that. They're the easiest ones to teach.
Yeah. And that's what Philip Yancey was saying when he was actually hearkening back when he said, when I'm at the low, to a previous story a couple of videos ago.
We're at the top, they don't want nothing to do with it.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's so here we'll get into some of the questions here. I thought this one was good. We know that it's important for people to receive the good news of the grace of Jesus Christ, the good news of the church. In your own background, did you first encounter the gospel as a good news or something else?
Something else.
Something else? Like do you want to elaborate at all? You don't have to.
The church that I grew up in was originally the German Lutheran church in the city. And the news was all fire and brimstone. It was, straighten up or you're going to go someplace you don't want to go. And if I ever hear any pastor ever again say, and Kierkegaard said,
Kierkegaard. But Kierkegaard's got all kinds of grace in him too, though. But yeah.
It over, it's like a hammer.
Really?
And of course, children were to be not seen and not heard at all. To the point where the ushers would come down the aisle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was that was,
I've heard
that was 407 years ago.
I always heard the Catholic way, and I grew up in a Catholic church. It was not that way at all.
Mhm.
I was not taught about fire and brimstone. No.
So it was good news for you?
But it was only, it was minimal. I mean, it was a ticket to heaven.
Okay, ticket to heaven, yeah.
It was my ticket to heaven.
Yeah.
And yes, I believed it was the Son of God. And yes, I believed he died. I believed all that,
Mhm.
but it's kind of stopped right there.
Yeah.
So, I built from there, but I was never raised with the fire and brimstone. Thank God I wasn't, but it was also charismatic. At the end there, it was more charismatic. Why it's even slain in the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
So it's a little different.
Yeah.
I think the examples that we get from parents passed down to children, or sometimes it's grandparents passed down to children. When I was young, you went to Sunday school, and our favorite song, we would sing it as we went out the door, was Jesus Loves Me, This I Know.
Right. Exactly.
And it was just embedded in me as a child. And at home, we would talk about the Bible at least once or twice a week. And my parents they were part of what started the local little church that we went to, but they were very strong on what God means to us. And the fact that church is a family of people that help each other. They came from farming communities that help each other. Yeah. And I always knew, no matter what, that God has my back.
Right.
It is a modern way of saying it. I had how could I not believe it's where I am?
As a child, you were taught as a child. That
Yeah.
helps.
All the way through.
Yeah. And you want to say something?
I don't know where to start. The Old Testament is full of the high priests, and it talks about as the high priest goes, so goes the congregation.
Congregation, yeah.
Okay, high priest was good, the
Thank God.
congregation was good, and the high priest was bad. And that's kind of
It's still
it carries through that way. What do you hear and where you
what you're sitting under.
sit under? I grew up in a Lutheran church in Pennsylvania, on a farm, down at a farm, and never knew anything about church. From the time I can remember, I remember the felt easel board and the little figurines, for Noah and his ark and everything. But I still grew up with this mentality that I call it a Santa Claus mentality. You do good, you get good, and do bad, you get bad, And that was kind of the underlying, push in my life. And you carry that a long ways until you find out that, you don't even call it grace at the time.
No.
But you start to see a difference in law and grace. And at the time when you make that discovery, you don't even call it law and grace. You just know that there's something else there besides that do good, get good, do bad, get bad.
Yeah.
And that's true, I find to this very day now. My wife and I, we've probably been to more churches than you can imagine. That's interesting to see what pastors put out there. There's I call it a cowboy church in Okeechobee.
Oh.
And the guy's pretty good. I mean, we went there and he was camped out in the book of John. The book of John has a lot to offer. And his ministry is focused on rehabilitating all these boys that are coming out of prison, And there's where his heart was. And you talked about, not having the feel for the ministry of to go into prison work. I think the Holy Spirit is the one that's going to give you that.
Absolutely.
Now the churches will push you into something that God didn't tell you to go to.
Yeah.
Now the Holy Spirit, if you listen to the prompting that He gives you, it'll be a comfortable prompting or uncomfortable prompting, And you say, I'm not comfortable with that, or I am comfortable with that. But you have this inner burning that just kind of leads you in that direction.
Well, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but so you do some history of the church here. Like this building was all in service of building this Alzheimer's daycare. So it's a day facility for Alzheimer's patients, which is, Ed helped us with that idea, like his wife had Alzheimer's and all of that. It's like a respite for their caregivers, their loved ones and all that stuff. And, they're cared for well in there. And so that was something that we kind of fell into and kind of followed that path. But, it's kind of like you say, like there's all these different people in it.
We have compassion in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
There's a church on Jenkins Road in Fort Pierce, also called a Grace Church. I don't know if you're affiliated or not. They also are into the Alzheimer's.
Yeah, that's the same company.
Oh, okay.
It's not the same affiliation of the church, but it's the same company. And so that we went with it, and also the same company at St. Andrews on Prima Vista. They have one as well. And so for me with all this, like, I really liked how it said something else, because I grew up in a very loving home, always went to church, all this stuff, but it was always like religious verger. I can't talk. I'm a public speaker, and I remember even on my way to seminary, it was much of my message was like, you got to do this. And it was almost like upholding to the structures that I knew around me. Oh, yeah. And that's, even though I grew up in LCMS church and all that stuff, and it's just, that's kind of what was handed down to me. I think that's what's handed down to a lot of people. And that's that's why I try to say at the edge of scandalous things sometimes to kind of jolt people out of it a little bit. And so that's what I like about that question with, like, was it good news or not? And some people, they're like, yeah, it was, and some people it's not. And I love that too, because we get to see that the church and everyone here, it's a myriad of differences between us, and that God is still working and planting those mustard seeds. And we don't have to discuss it this time, but I hope that this book and study has been an encouragement and has really lit up your imagination about how you can plant those mustard seeds of God's grace around you, and all those things. That it doesn't have to be those big things. I think that's good. Let's see. So let's do some of our Bible stuff. The first place that we're going to be in. I'm not going to pull it up on the screen. We'll just look at it. It's going to be Jeremiah 29. If I say Jeremiah 29, what verse do you automatically think of?
I'm going to get the Bible.
11. There you go. Does anyone know that one off the top of their head? Yeah. There we go. Pam got it. Pam has it. I know the plans that I have for you. You have declared the Lord. And so I'll just open the New King James first. So we'll read that one first, but then I want to go backwards and see how Jeremiah gets to that verse 11. So Jeremiah 29, verse 11. So the verse 11 is this, and this probably a quarter of all Bible covers that are sold probably have this verse on them somewhere, right? It's a really popular verse. All right, so here it is. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace, not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Nice verse. And remember, Jeremiah is writing to God's people that were in exile into Babylon. And to kind of catch everyone up on my theory of the exile is I think that God's people, they wanted to be powerful like Babylon their entire existence. And God finally went, you want to be Babylon so bad? Here you go. You can be part of them, right? And so he's talking to them. So we go back to verse 4 now. Go back to verse 4 in Jeremiah 29, verse 4. It says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who are carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and dwell in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters, And take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city where I've caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord, for in this peace you will have peace. So we're going to stop there, but it kind of continues going to that 11. But if you look at what it's talking about there, it's talking about investing and continuing going even in the midst of that captivity.
114.
And that's such a different message than what you often hear. And it kind of caps it off with that verse that we all know, for I know the plans that I have for you. You know, like it's like invest in here. And it's almost like that, what Jesus brings up as like investing mustard seeds or the yeast in the dough. I love the yeast in the dough thing, because to all good Jewish boys and girls that would be listening to him, yeast was always considered something bad, especially around the Passover, you know, because that was like, you got to get the yeast out to have unleavened bread and all this stuff. So he uses it talking about the kingdom of God as like yeast. Like that would be scandalous. Like the Pharisees are like waving themselves like, well, I declare, you know, you can't have stuff like that. And that's, you know, an amazing idea. And you can see that idea of God and his prophets is even sitting here in the Old Testament. And that's, I think it's great. So, do anyone have any thoughts about that before we go? We're going to go to Luke chapter 7 next. Luke chapter 7. And I'll have this one on the screen for us. Hearing myself read that last little bit is why I let the computer read to us. Like that's, so Luke chapter 7. Now I need to set up Luke chapter 7. We're going to be in, officially kind of start with, oh man.
19.
It's after John the Baptist. Let's see here. And the woman comes up.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, all right, yeah. So it's actually going to be 36 is where we're going to start. But I want to back up and get to right before verse 36. So to the newer people in the room, the one thing you got to understand about me is I'm obsessed with context. Like why is this written? And I think especially the gospel writers, but the writers in the scriptures in general are writing these amazing works of art, crafting these stories together. It's not like an encyclopedia entry that says, hey, this is what Jesus did on February 6th, year 2. You know, like that. That's not what they're doing. They're crafting a story so that you can see a picture of Jesus, the picture that the gospel writer Luke wants you to see. And so everything kind of moves and flows all together. So that's kind of, before we read about the Pharisee and the sinful woman in the house, we need to read the last few verses of the story that was before it. And what's going on is John the Baptist's disciples are coming up to Jesus. And they're like, are you the one who's come, or should we wait for another? And it kind of caps off with Jesus saying, what'd you come out in the wilderness to see? Did you come out to see the wind blowing through the trees? Is that what you came out to see? Or did you come out to see a prophet? Like that's, yeah. And all the more like over there. And then he says this, and this is verse 33. For John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking wine, and you say that he's got a demon. And the Son of Man, he comes eating and he has come eating and drinking. And you say, look at a glutton and a wine bibbler is what it says in the King James here. A friend of tax collectors and sinners, but wisdom is justified by her children. So
Today.
like that's, and this is what and so have this context of like, they're looking at John the Baptist. Are you the one? You know, John the Baptist people are like, are you the one, Jesus? And they're like, some people have accused John of having demons in him with not drinking and stuff like that. And here I am drinking as Jesus. And you think I'm just a drunk and all that stuff. And so you take that context and then we'll read this next story. So verse 36 through the end of the chapter, verse 50. And so let me share the screen for everyone at home and make sure, hopefully I'm on the right one here. Share. Oh, I'm on Jeremiah, but don't worry. I got this one right here. Okay, here we go.
Then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil and stood at his feet behind him weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wipe them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself,
"This man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner."
Simon, I have something to say to you.
"Teacher, say it."
There was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more?
"I suppose the one whom he forgave more."
You have rightly judged.
Then he turned to the woman.
Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little.
Then he said to her,
Your sins are forgiven.
And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves,
Who is this who even forgives sins?
Then he said to the woman,
Your faith has saved you. Go in peace.
I want to read the next 3 verses of the next chapter too.
Now it came to pass afterward that he went through every city and village preaching and bringing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons, and Joanna the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. And when a great multitude had gathered.
There we go. All right. So I wanted to do that last little bit because last couple weeks ago in the sermon, I think, I talked about the women supporting Jesus' ministry. And I think in the way Luke is crafting the story, he has like, the disciples of John are like, are you the one? Respect another. And then we have this whole like drunken talk, about demons and drunkards. And then you have this story of this woman of the night showing up in a Pharisee's house, which is odd. We'll get into that. and her sins are forgiven. And then right after that, you see the women are almost taking like a leadership role there. They're financially supporting what Jesus is doing. And there's like this little bit. And then right after that, did you notice we didn't read it? Do you see what the next story is? It's the sower of the seeds. It's all the seeds going on the paths and all that stuff. It's almost like planting of mustard seeds. Like all this stuff is telling a singular story in here that Jesus is using, not the ones that are the biggest and the best. Like he keeps going down and planting these seeds. And so like, I just think that's interesting. So in our story that we read, what are some details that kind of stood out to you that you thought were interesting?
That the Pharisees didn't do the normal thing with Jesus. Everybody's feet were washed when you would come into a house like that. Why weren't they?
Yeah. So he's, and this is what I love about it. Like we want to contextualize it for today. Like it's like, man, I walked in your house and like I heard the AC click off, and the temperature's been rising up 3 degrees while I've been in here. Like it's like you got me a cerveza. You got me a good cerveza, and I saw that it was sitting on the counter for a couple hours before you actually poured it for me, right? Like that's It's these all these like things, and it's contrasting with this woman. Like that's like all these things that go hand in hand with what understood hospitality was. Jesus isn't getting. So it's like this Pharisees doing a power trip on Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's see what this dude does, you know? Yeah.
The Pharisees invited him there to entrap him, first of all.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was their motive.
So let's talk about that woman that's there. Why is that woman there? Because that's what you're talking about, right? Like, why is that woman there? You know, and how did she get there?
Get into the house, right?
Yeah, because it's in a house. It's not like they're in the park, you know, like he's in his house. And all of a sudden this woman shows up, and I love the monologue going on with that Pharisee. It's like, surely if this guy was like knew anything and all that thing, he would know who this terrible woman was. You know, like that's wild. And it goes back to that thinking that Philip Yancey was talking about. That's so easy for us to fall into, that is, to quote you, like it's very law-centric, is like those that, you know, like you're either in or you're out. And it's almost like that Pharisee saying, she's out. Doesn't this guy know that?
I saw where she was loved, but she received more by receiving grace. She was receiving grace right there. And that's exactly what that whole thing was about. But for those who are forgiven much, love much.
Yeah.
Okay. But she was forgiven much, and he said, your faith has saved you.
Mm-hmm.
You were saved by what? Grace.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all grace.
And
Received.
And that's all she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all she wanted. And the Pharisee needs it.
His grace abounds.
Yeah. And the Pharisee needs it too. But he knows that he's above it, and he wants no part in it. And so like that's kind of fascinating here. And I like how you said that he was there to entrap Jesus with that woman, because that woman, she knew her way in.
Yeah.
Yeah, she knew her way in, and she wasn't there on accident. Yeah, and that's good. And by Jesus, by showing like constant grace, and then contrasting it with how he wasn't receiving any of that grace by hospitality by the Pharisee.
I asked myself, who was this woman? Did this woman have an encounter with Jesus prior to this?
I don't
know.
Yeah. So what makes you say that? What makes you say that? That's an intriguing thing.
Well, she was, to go back to the woman that was caught in adultery and wanted to stone her to death and everything else. She experienced his grace right then and there. I believe this woman is that woman.
Oh yeah. So that story from John. So the one that you're talking about, with the woman caught in adultery, and that was when they drag her out in front of Jesus, and they're all like, "We need to stone her, Jesus," and they're like all that stuff, and Jesus bends down and writes something in the ground, and we don't know. That's I think John chapter 8, maybe 6. I don't know, something like that. That was actually the reading that they had suggested. And so in this, I thought it was more interesting to talk about this one. But as soon as you made that connection, I was like, let's talk. That was the reason that they suggested. Yeah.
And seems like preachers everywhere are quick to fill in the missing blanks. So we have to be careful as a preacher to refill in the missing blanks correctly.
Yeah.
No matter what kind of a person I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ann. Go ahead.
No matter what kind of a person she was, she had a pure heart.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
God knows that.
And I think like her desire for forgiveness, like that really seems to be a place that Jesus is drawing us to, is us having a desire for grace and forgiveness for ourselves, and really not looking down at the other people. It's like, oh, you need Jesus, like, you know, that whole thing. Like that's, yeah.
Kind of changing the subject a little bit, but in the Bible, other Bible study we go to, there's a man that came in there and he used an acronym that I thought was quite good. and he talked about grace. Now we think, oh, this God's grace is a free gift. But he says grace, G-R-A-C-E, is God's riches at Christ's expense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it costs God everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's grace that we get.
Mm-hmm.
We gotta keep that in the archives of our mind, I think.
And I think that's like Philip Yancey in the video, when he talked about like the picture of God that we have is Jesus. And you see multiple times that Jesus is very empathetic. If you've ever been to a funeral that I've led, like I talk about this all the time, where Jesus with Lazarus, and when his sisters come running up to him, you get that one verse that says Jesus wept. That, you know, that God feels your pain in that too. And that's the same God who went to the cross and rose again. You know, like and you can see that same empathy in our story here. Pam, you look like you wanted to say something a little bit. Did you? Okay. I just want to make sure like that's.
I think too, for this story, it's important to pay attention to the Pharisees' reaction, because as someone who grew up in a church, I'm familiar with the church. It's easy for me to go to church or different churches and stuff. And like you said, you can't judge people who've never had that experience or have fallen away. Or it's so easy to say, oh, I'm doing all the right thing.
Yeah.
I got it. I know what's going on. I got it. And that's kind of where the Pharisee is. And that's the bigger sin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what like he said in the book, the thriving Christians, like in the beginning in Acts and stuff, they were the minority and persecuted, and the church thrived. And now once the church got into running the politics of a place, that's when it became corrupt and
Self-righteousness.
and they lost the sight of what's the church for.
Mm-hmm. And that's so I need to be a little prideful with all you guys here in a little bit. So last year we did a sermon on the Gospel of Mark, our sermon series on the Gospel of Mark, where we called it Revealing True Power. And the revelation of the three powers that my thesis is, and all that, is that it's revealing our individual wants of power, our political wants of power, and our wants of power for religion too. So personal, political, and religious, you know, and we see in the Gospel of Mark that all those three desires for power all die on the cross, you know, and are reborn. The three things that he talked about in the video are very similar to that.
Yeah.
You know, with the individual, with the community, and the society. Like, and all three were very similar. And I was when I was reading it, I was like, that's right. Me and Philip Yancey. I like that because you understand last year that was the theme, those three powers. And so like but yeah, I thought that was really it. I was like, yeah, there it is. Because I think it always exists where we are trying to get something from it, where we are trying to get our churches in line with it or something like that. And then also just trying to get power from the politics around us. And you see the way Jesus deals with this woman. We see what we know, like the Pharisees wanted to use that woman to get their ends. And how disgusting is that? You know? And like, it happens all the time. Like you look around and you see people get paraded around as like, you know, for their own political ends or personal ends, that we use people, you know, like that's the heart of the second half of like how Luther explains the 10 Commandments. He's like, don't use people. Like that's, you know, and I think, you know, as we look at this, we can be freed from that wantings of power, from that one where we can just know that we're okay, to quote us at the beginning, by knowing that God has showed us grace, and he's even showed Cheryl grace, and even you guys over there, you know, that he's all shown us grace, and that we can look and we can be okay. And then everything we do isn't about trying to just better ourselves. It's just like, I'm showing that grace to them because we're fine. So I don't know. Does anyone have any closing thoughts before we say goodbye to the YouTube
something
folks.
interesting in my study Bible. It says, in the Gospel of Luke, he points out certain women who had been healed by Jesus or forgiven by Jesus, helped provide for him. He introduced 13 women who don't appear in any other Gospels.
And Luke does? Yeah. Well, so you got to remember too, Luke and Acts, like Acts is Luke 2. And so like it's basically the same story, and it goes into the church, and a lot of these same ideas come about. My philosophy on what happened in Luke and Acts is you have the story of God visible in Jesus, and then Acts is God visible in the church. And so much so that Paul kind of takes that vision onto himself, and there's even another crucifixion at the end. It's Paul's shipwreck. But Paul's shipwreck isn't Paul's salvation for us, but we are participating with Paul, that no matter what may come, that we can participate and face all those things, that it's the way of Jesus type of thing. And so yeah, and there's women are doing all kinds of things. And in that society, women are much more mustard seeds than the dudes are. And that's my favorite thing to think about now, is if all this was being written today, who would it be today? Would it still be women? Maybe. Would it be someone else in society? Maybe, and that's just a fun exercise to think, how would the grace of God become evident in, was it 2023 here in Port St. Lucie? It's a fun exercise. We can't go too far with it. Like our friend here, that said that gotta be careful we don't fill in all the gaps, because then we start making it about ourselves. But going into that a little bit, I think, helps us become more humble servants. Yeah. So was there anything else? All right. Well, for everyone watching on YouTube's on the pre-recorded, thanks for watching us.